So I'd just like to talk to you a little bit about research questions and what makes a good research question. And you may be wondering, I really don't have an idea of what I want to do. I'm not really for sure, the scope of the assignment, but particularly for this assignment, this is considered an in-class assignment. And for those of you that don't have a classroom, I'll partner you up, so don't worry about that. We'll take care of that. But you will be doing something action research. Typically, this is done within a classroom, so you'll be looking for something maybe you like to improve, or maybe something you're curious about. It could be about classroom management. It could be about content work. There's a vast array of studies that I've helped students with for the past several years, and they range from comparing art projects to, the score on an art project to the score that a student took on a summative assessment, and comparing is the practical-based assessment compares to the written assessment or the content assessment, and comparing those. Sometimes students will choose to do something over maybe some BIST data or some classroom management programming that they have in their building and look at that to see if it's different. The one thing about this is not generalizable. It's just for your classroom. It's just to really teach you the process of, hey, let's look at some data in the classroom. Let's modify some things in the classroom, and then let's see what happens if there's a change. Sometimes it could venture outside of maybe not a modification in the classroom, but it could be relate to, like I said, like a classroom management, some overall school data, which is okay too. We just want to make sure that it is just held within your school, your classroom, if possible, and that we're using not identifiable data. And if we have some identifiable data, that is removed for the process. So thinking about that, think about things that you might want to change, or what happens to student learning in my classroom when this happens. For example, thinking about writing. When students write to a prompt, when they're given a prompt, what happens when what is their writing like? Does it improve if it's self-directed or if it's something that you told them to write about? Or maybe you want to implement a new process. So think about that first, about what things like that interest you. And then good research questions are meaningful and important to you. So think about something that's important to you that you really want to spend some time on, because you're going to spend 8 weeks on this. Something that's manageable. If you submit a question that's very, very broad and it's just not something that could be tackled in a semester or 8 weeks, I'll let you know and I'll reach back out to you. So I want this to be manageable. I want it to be important for learners, but also important for you, and some way that you can take action and do something different. We really want it to be authentic. This isn't like again, it's not a dissertation. It's not a paper that you're going to submit anywhere else. It's just for this classroom, for this activity. And it's authentic in that you will be writing in your paper I or we. So if you do the project on your own, you can refer to yourself all the way through it, or we through it, whichever is appropriate. And really the only boundary is that you do not create a question that's a yes or no. So we're going to look at some examples in the next slide, and that kind of help you guide like how to create a good question. All right, so here are some examples of some teacher action research questions. For example, what happens to the quality of student writing when we implement peer editing through our 9th grade English classes? This would be something pretty easy to implement into a classroom and do and gather some data on, and to see if their student writing improves, or what modifications could be made. Another question here, I won't read them all, but what happens to students' academic performance in our 6th grade classroom when we assign heterogeneous groups for cooperative learning activities? I mean, that's a great question. I'm not so sure it would make much difference. It might, but it is formed in the right way. So remember, we don't want those closed questions of a yes or no that's going to give us a yes or no answer. We want open-ended. So what happens, or how does this impact, or in what ways are good ways to start questions. Another good question might be, what happens to my students' academic performance in history when I give daily quizzes on homework assignments? So that would be another very simple thing to implement in a classroom, looking at students' grades overall, and then when you're implementing those daily quizzes and homeworks, does it change? Does that mean they're looking back? I mean, even one thing in this course that I would look at, previously I've not done hypothesis, so we have not annotated the text, we've just done quizzes. I actually like the annotation, so it'd be nice for me to go back and kind of look at, performance and understanding. To do that, I would need to implement a quiz, which I'm not going to do, but I could implement a quiz to see if students perform better on the quiz now that they've annotated the text. So actually that's something you could do in your classroom. It'd be super easy. So these are just a few examples. So as with anything, there's always variables that come into play when you're looking at doing any type of research. Again, this is an action research project or a collaborative action research project, in that we're really looking what's happening in the classroom. So you could do a whole process of gathering some data, but we have to always understand that, there's student variables that affect student learning. There's classroom variables, teacher variables, and how we deliver things, and then school variables. So not that everything, like if you do your research study, there are some assumptions that you can make, and then there's also some of these things that we have to consider as variables that impact student learning that are maybe outside of our control. All right, so this is your response slide. I will give you the video or the voice option, either one. You're able to click the plus button down at the bottom and either add a video or just a verbal response here. And so I'm giving you a little bit of guidance here. So kind of as a sentence starter, if you're thinking about what you would like to, one of these categories, like what you would like to improve, or what are you curious about, or something that you think might make a difference. So refer to the prompts below, and I want you to kind of post an idea about that with a corresponding research question. For example, I'm going to do one for you. I would like to improve student writing. So that's something I would like to improve. And so I might have two questions. What happens to students writing when I give the prompt? And what happens with students writing when it is a student selected prompt? So in other words, I really want to know, are students writing, like you could measure on depth of the context, or you could measure it on quantity as well. It just really depends on what you're looking for. But if I'm really wanting to improve student writing, I really would like to know, is it better for me to give them a prompt to write, or is it better for me to let them have their own choice of prompt? And that could actually be another one. You could even have another question: what happens to student writings when given a choice from pre-selected prompts? So I believe in student choice, and so I might assume that would increase student writing where they either have choice or they're self-selecting the prompt. However, you may have students that just they don't want to create their own prompt. They'd rather say, you tell me what to write about, and then I'll write about that. So I've done a study with a student on this actually last spring, and it was very interesting just to see kind of the difference in the writing. And so he gave out, like he spent a couple weeks giving out the prompts for students writing. It was in a foreign language. And then he collected that and kind of analyzed the data for quantity and depth of content. And then the next couple weeks, he allowed them to choose their own prompt and did a comparison. So again, this isn't a full-blown research project in that I'm really wanting to see what practices in my classroom make a difference and how I might use some different strategies or processes that just help student learning. So that would be kind of an example. So think about maybe one of these little topics, what you're interested in, what you're curious about. And when you post that part, I want you to come up with a research question. So remember, use those beginning phrases like what happens when or how does. So those are very open-ended and not